Space Mountain. This decades-old indoor roller coaster remains one of Disney's most popular attractions. The story of how this ride came to be is more interesting than you think. I'm Clover, and this is Loop with Clover Loop. We're about to find out why Space Mountain was and is one of Disney's most innovative ideas.
Space Mountain is one of my all-time favorite coasters, but I don't just love it because it's an awesome ride. It's a huge part of Disney history and a testament to the kind of innovation that Disney has been committed to bringing to its park goers since the very beginning.
So let's talk a little bit about the history of Space Mountain and how it's evolved over the years and across all of Disney's parks. And stick around to the end because we're also going to tell you some fun facts about this attraction that you probably didn't know. Space Mountain's origins go back almost to the beginning of Disney theme parks themselves. It wasn't an opening day attraction at Disneyland in 1955, but the earliest ideas for Space Mountain started being kicked around by Walt himself in the early 1960s.
A lot of the credit for Space Mountain coming to life goes to the Matterhorn, which was the first roller coaster style attraction at Disneyland Park, and the very first tubular steel coaster in the world. It was a huge success and really set a new bar for the type of immersive experience you could build around a roller coaster. And yeah, Walt wanted more of that.
When Disneyland opened, Tomorrowland really didn't live up to its name. All of the attractions were heavily sponsored, and none of them was very futuristic. So once Disneyland became a bit more well-established, Tomorrowland was one of the first places that Walt and the Imagineers looked to make an upgrade.
The earliest concepts of Space Mountain, originally called Spaceport and later Space Voyage, were super ambitious. The Imagineers, led by John Hench, originally envisioned a huge structure with 4 tracks. Like the Matterhorn, the original design had the tracks weaving inside and outside. Ultimately, Walt passed on this concept because, for one, it was going to be too massive of a project. But also, he worried that having the cars go outside would lose the immersive effect of being in space. He wanted this to be more like a dark ride, but in coaster form.
So the concept went back to John Hench and his team, and they all scaled it back. But at the same time, John Hench, who was an early computer nut, decided that he wanted the ride to be fully automated by computers. And this had never been done before. And that's because, frankly, it couldn't be done. Computing power just wasn't where it needed to be yet. So the spaceport concept went back on the shelf and essentially just waited for the technology to catch up to the idea.
In the meantime, Disneyland kept changing, and by the time the technology to do what Disney wanted to do had caught up in the late 60s, Disneyland had moved on from its Tomorrowland revamp. So the project was resurfaced for Disney World instead. You see, Disney World didn't have the right spot for a Matterhorn attraction, but the team really wanted an immersive roller coaster experience, and they needed an anchor attraction in Tomorrowland. So Space Voyage, which was renamed Space Mountain when the concept came over to Disney World, was a perfect fit.
Disney brought RCA on board as a sponsor, and RCA put up $10 million to get the project moving. Construction started in 1972 and took about 2.5 years to complete. Space Mountain officially debuted to Magic Kingdom park goers in 1975.
When it was completed, Space Mountain was the first of its kind in many ways. It was the first ever fully indoor roller coaster and also the first ever to be fully operated by computers. This revolutionized the industry because it meant vehicles could be precisely deployed and simultaneously shut down if anything went wrong, making Space Mountain one of the safest coaster experiences in the world at the time.
Since opening in 1975 at Magic Kingdom, Space Mountain has been through a number of evolutions, both at its location in Florida and also in the shape it's taken at Disney parks around the world. Today there's a version of Space Mountain at 5 of the 6 Disney resorts worldwide. The Disneyland version of Space Mountain opened in 1977, just 2 years after the Disney World version opened. But the Disneyland attraction is actually much smaller in scale than the one in Florida. Tokyo Disneyland also opened with its own version of Space Mountain in 1983, and Hong Kong Disneyland Space Mountain opened in 2005. Both were pretty much identical to the one at Disneyland. Disneyland Paris was a little different. It originally opened in 1995 as Space Mountain de la Terre à la Lune, a Jules Verne-inspired design that included inversions. It was renovated in 2005 and re-emerged as Space Mountain Mission 2.
Shanghai Disneyland is actually the only Disney resort without a Space Mountain-inspired attraction, and that's most likely because the resort was the first to get the Tron Light Cycle Power Run coaster.
Okay, so what about the Disney World original? Well, that one has seen its share of changes over the years as well. For one, there's the sponsorship. When Space Mountain first opened, its queue was basically a big ad for RCA, as was the post show that you saw when you departed. When you walked in, you'd see RCA's cute little mascot Nipper sitting in a flying saucer and listening to a phonograph, as he does, and RCA's theme and various product displays would follow you through the line. On the way out, you'd be treated to a bunch of future-y scenes involving products that perhaps RCA might make someday.
Like most Disney attraction sponsorships, things fluctuated over the years. In 1993, Federal Express took over as the Space Mountain sponsor, and suddenly that post-show was all about packages being zapped through space on beams of light. In 2004, the FedEx sponsorship ceased, and so did all the sponsor branding on Space Mountain, paving the way for the cleaner, traditional space theming we see today.
Beyond the sponsorship changes, the ride's seen some improvements over the years, including upgrades to the ride system, cars, and cosmetic changes. During a 1989 refurbishment, the ride vehicles received a notable upgrade. Up until then, the ride featured cars very similar to the Matterhorn bobsleds, where two passengers could sit toboggan style, one directly in front of the other in a single car. The 1989 refurbishment changed this to individual seating for the ride, but kept the overall toboggan-type aesthetic for the cars.
Do you remember the original ride system? Have you ever been devastated by its closure or been riding it when it broke down? Let us know in the comments.
Beyond ride upgrades, we should note that Disney is not afraid to play around with this classic attraction from time to time. In fact, over the years, Space Mountain has seen its share of overlays. For example, around the Halloween season, Space Mountain at Disneyland transforms into Ghost Galaxy with scary, ghostly space projections and a new creepy soundtrack. Disneyland has also featured Rockin' Space Mountain with a Red Hot Chili Peppers soundtrack, and in 2015, riders got to be part of an X-Wing starfighter battle in the Hyperspace Mountain overlay, part of a Star Wars event called Season of the Force.
Space Mountain has always and will continue to evolve as one of Disney's most iconic attractions, and we can't wait to see where the future takes it. Now, let's talk trivia.
Okay, I love fun ride trivia, so let's talk about some lesser-known Space Mountain facts.
Number 1. The Space Mountain structure is unique by design. Specifically, you'll notice there are massive concrete structural beams on the outside of Space Mountain. This isn't normal. Usually structural beams go on the inside of a building, but for Space Mountain, the design team wanted as many huge flat wall surfaces inside as possible in order to project uninterrupted swaths of space. So they essentially designed the building inside out.
Also, the size of Space Mountain is a bit of a story in itself. The structure that houses it was conceived as a massive building, so massive in fact that Disney was afraid that the building housing Space Mountain would tower over the castle in the center of the park, which has always been intended as the visual highlight of the park. So Space Mountain was scaled back and kept intentionally shorter than the castle so as to not take away from the castle's impressiveness.
Number 2. Space Mountain cost more to build than the entire Disneyland park. It's true. When Disneyland opened in 1955, the final price tag to build it was $17 million. When Space Mountain opened 20 years later, in 1975, it represented an $18 million investment for Disney.
Number 3, Space Mountain is actually really slow. This often surprises people because Space Mountain is considered a classic thrill ride. But Space Mountain actually tops out at a top speed of 28 miles an hour. Compare that to Big Thunder Mountain, which gets up to 35 miles an hour, and Splash Mountain, which tops an impressive 40 miles per hour on its hill. In fact, the only Disney thrill ride that goes slower is the Barnstormer, which is essentially a kiddie coaster. So that just goes to show you how incredibly effective Disney was at creating the illusion of speed through darkness and other effects.
Number 4. A lot of real-life astronauts have been involved with Space Mountain over the years. Back when Disneyland was working on its version of the ride, they hired astronaut Gordon Cooper as a creative consultant for the attraction. And NASA astronauts attended the opening day ceremonies for both Disney World and Disneyland's grand openings of the ride. Finally, back in 2005, when Disneyland unveiled its revamped Space Mountain attraction, Neil Armstrong himself was there for the unveiling.
So there you have it, the history and evolution of Space Mountain, along with some fun facts. We'll see you next time, and
If you can't tell, we really love making videos like this. So if you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing to our channel. That is, without a doubt, the best way to support our growing channel right now.